Oh, yeah. Oh.
What are you doing? Is that Elton John's birthday or something?
No, Michael, these American glasses actually help me to see life in Denmark through American eyes. So they're reminding me of all the things that Americans first noticed when they moved to Denmark.
You know, it is really hard for us to get back in that mindset of 5 years ago when we were fresh off the plane and everything was new and different and exciting.
Yeah, and even though we have a lot of American friends and family come and they tell us what their first impressions of Denmark are and the first things that they notice, these are still helpful. So I have an extra pair.
Oh, let me try these on.
Yeah. And I thought today we would talk about 12 things that Americans first notice when they move to Denmark. See what I mean?
I see it now.
Let's get started.
Now, when I step back to when I first got off the train at Nordport Station to go to our first little flat over there, I remember seeing the sea of bikes. And that is the first thing that you notice when you come to Copenhagen and Denmark in general is bikes everywhere. Bike lanes everywhere. I remember coming here with a colleague who got out of the taxi and almost got killed by, not really killed, but got hit by a biker in the bike lane because they thought it was a sidewalk, and in reality, it's a bike superhighway they're getting onto. First thing you notice, and you see it everywhere, especially in the bigger cities, but even out in the countryside where you see people biking on the side of the road.
Yeah. And even though we come from a part of America in a city where people do bike, Philadelphia is pretty flat. And they actually started putting some dedicated bike lanes into the very narrow streets, though. It's just completely different in Denmark. And it doesn't matter if you're in a city or if you're in a small town or a village. There's probably going to be a lot of people biking, and it's just a way of life here. So definitely it's something that people notice right away. Mm-hmm. And on that note, I think another thing that people notice is that Danes and the people that you see in town are pretty active and therefore also pretty fit. You see a lot of people jogging, running, and that's not to say that this doesn't happen in other parts of the world or that it's unique to Denmark, but you definitely notice that people are generally walking, riding bikes, and finding ways to do outdoor fitness, and just in general, people are a lot more active.
Yeah, you definitely see that going around, and it's something that definitely stands out when you first come over. You see people running all the time. Back to biking again, people biking to and from work, even on the morning commute or the afternoon commute in that way. You definitely see that happening. But the flip side of that is the third thing that we noticed when we first came over here, which is how much people smoke. And you see it whether it's people on the street that are smoking, or especially when you go into some of the little bodegas and older bars, and there's smoking in there. You feel like you're walking back into the 1990s and you walk into a smoke-filled room. It's insane for us.
Yeah, it's definitely insane. In the state that we come from in the U.S., you haven't been able to smoke indoors in bars for
Early
almost 20 years. Yeah, probably over 20 years. So it's definitely a bit jarring and very surprising. And that's pretty much the case all over America in, cities, rural areas, in conservative areas. It's not something that was ever politicized. And that's kind of ironic because most things are. But yeah, you just don't really smoke in the U.S. Now, another thing, and kind of on the topic of smoking, is you can't even smoke, outside of a building when you're in the U.S. And it's funny because you have these beautiful buildings in Denmark with, if you're not allowed to smoke inside of them, people are still just outside just smoking, and you're getting exposed to it. But the buildings are definitely so much older. And I think that's one thing that Americans quickly notice is that, some of the oldest buildings in the U.S. are basically going back to the 18th century, but here you have much, much older buildings and structures. And, for most Americans, it's really interesting to notice that. And especially in a lot of the bigger cities like Copenhagen, Aarhus, Aalborg, like these cities are so good at building new architecture and new buildings that kind of fit perfectly, and the aesthetic with the old buildings and the new architecture and the new buildings that are built is really superb. And I've heard people comment on that specific thing too.
Yeah, it's just kind of funny thinking about in Philadelphia, the oldest building that still remains there is the Old Swedes Church from 1620s, 1630s. And we walk by the round tower all the time, and it says 1637 on the side of it. I forget the exact year, but that's the difference that you have here. It's a heck of a lot older in that way.
And imagine how many other buildings were standing before that.
Yeah. And speaking of standing out there, one of the other big things that we noticed, especially when we first came over, because it was Christmas season, was that people are outside year round. We know it's kind of cliche here. People say, oh, there's no bad weather, there's only bad clothing. But I remember we first came over in November. You were over in November as well. People were outside of the Christmas markets. They were having glögg and walking around outside everything, even though it was crummy, rainy, normal November weather. People are still outside. They're doing fitness outside. They're riding their bikes to work outside. It's simply something you deal with because you know it's going to be rainy and gray and cool for a lot of the months of the year. And you just deal with it with, nice jackets and sweaters and boots and whatever you need to survive outside.
Yeah, but I would say that it's a little bit easier to deal with it because temperatures don't swing quite as much as they do in the US. So where we come from, and really in most of the country, in the summer you get a lot more extreme temperatures where it's extremely hot and it's just unbearable to be outside without being in a building that's air conditioning. So I really enjoy the fact that even though there are parts of Europe and the rest of the world that have a little bit nicer weather, the temperatures generally in Denmark are that you can be outside, maybe just with a warm pair of boots and a scarf during the winter. But it's generally not where you're going to be freezing like in some parts of the US. Now, I don't know if it's because of the fitness or all of that outside activity that they're doing, but I generally think and have heard many people say, wow, everybody here is really good looking. And it could be the health focus. It could be all kinds of things. I don't know. Maybe it's just that simple, the good Nordic genes and the simple minimalist dress and makeup and whatever. But man, women just generally are pretty good looking in Denmark. So
yeah, good on you, Dane. There certainly is good people watching around here for that. Definitely people notice that when they come over. Everyone is so attractive. Everyone's so good looking. It's, I guess it's that Nordic conceit that's kind of a cliche as well, but it's absolutely true.
Yeah, I was like a 7 in Philadelphia, but I'm like a solid 3 or 4 in Denmark. But
you're a 10 to me.
Yeah.
Now, while you were fishing for compliments, I'm thinking about what else it is that we kind of had a little bit unique when we first came over. And honestly, it's coffee culture too. I mean, I think there's a couple things with it you notice. One is that I think in the U.S., coffee is more seen as something that you do very first thing in the morning. And here, a lot of coffee shops don't even open until 7 o'clock, 7:30. So it may not even be in time for your morning commute. Also, different kinds of coffee here. Everything is much more espresso-based. It's a very European thing, as opposed to in the U.S., where filter coffee is much more common. Though, certainly the espresso bars are getting a little bit more common as you go through in a different way. But here, to get a filter coffee like you're used to, especially if you go into a restaurant, maybe have some breakfast and get that bottomless cup of coffee. You don't really find that over here that much. Outside of a couple American cafes we actually have found in Copenhagen.
Yeah, I know the first time that I went out into the world looking for coffee, and definitely when we have friends come over, I always have to tell them, like, no, order an Americano. It's going to be the most similar thing to a filter coffee that you're used to at your coffee place back home, and that's just what you're gonna have to do. You also hear a lot of Americans, the culture part is so different too, say things like, oh, I can't have coffee after noon or I'll never sleep. And the first time I said that to a Danish person, they just started laughing at me like, that's so stupid and American. But it's really true for me, at least I think so.
I don't understand people that get a double espresso at 10 o'clock at night and think they're going to go to sleep within the next 30 minutes.
It's also funny how important it is to the work culture too. I know most of the offices that I've worked in, if the coffee machine was down, probably it would be excusable to say, I'm going to finish the day at home and just leave. And speaking of coffee, we definitely have to talk about food and especially, grocery shopping, but really even retail shopping isn't quite as convenient as a lot of Americans are used to. I think we're used to having a ton more options, especially when it comes to superstores and things like that. Of course, your Walmart, your Target, your Costco, all of those things, your warehouse stores, I guess you could call them. But it's also common for those places to be open super late at night or even have ones that are open 24 hours. So if you need batteries or toilet paper in the middle of the night, you can go to those places at 3 o'clock in the morning, 4 o'clock in the morning, and find a selection of things that you need. And that's not always the case in Denmark. You have to do a lot more planning, and generally it's not something that people would want others working those kinds of hours or those kinds of shifts.
I think the funniest experience that we had with that was our first New Year's. So one of the big things here is that obviously there's a holiday, stores are going to be closed, including grocery stores. We assumed we were having people over for New Year's Eve. We could go get stuff during the afternoon, no problem at all. And then we suddenly realized that come 2 o'clock in the afternoon, there was one Netto open in the whole of Copenhagen, and everybody was there doing the same thing. Ooh, we barely made it. We thought we were going to have a New Year's Eve hosted by 7-Eleven, but fortunately we were able to get some proper food.
Yeah, and that just in the U.S., they would probably be open pretty late on New Year's, maybe even the whole night.
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking of food, one other thing that definitely is different as we came here is that dining out is different. I mean, for one, the cuisine is different. I mean, you find that in the US, you have maybe a lot more, I'd say, mid-level restaurants that are out there, whereas in Denmark, it tends to be more on the cafe side or more towards, I'd say, fine dining. But the entire experience is different as well. You find, especially at the finer restaurants, a lot of fixed menus as opposed to a la carte. In the US, it's very rare to find that you'd have something like that. I think also in the dining culture is that when you sit down, you're at that table potentially for the entire night. Whereas in the US, they're trying to turn you over after maybe 90 minutes, 2 hours max.
Pushed out the door.
Push out the door. Obviously, there's the part about how tipping is not really a thing here, as opposed to the US, where it is foundational to the salaries of all the wait staff that's working there. And probably one of the funniest ones is that when it comes time for the bill, in the US, they're hovering over you, ready to give you that check so they make sure you get out of there. Whereas in Denmark, I feel like I have to go wander around the halls of the restaurant to find the server to finally get that check so we can go.
And it sounds like we could probably do an entire video on this, and we might do that. So let us know in the comments if you think you'd like to see that. But I would also say one other thing that people that come visit us don't realize and really struggle with is that you're not going to be able to arrive in Denmark, Copenhagen, any city or town in Denmark at 9 o'clock at night and think that you're going to be able to go and get food, whether it's at a restaurant or anything else. Your only option at that hour is going to be fast food. There's no real pub food like in the US, and that gets lost on a lot of people that come to visit here for the first time. Okay, another thing that is very different than in the US is that even, especially in the major cities of Denmark, you don't have a lot of tall buildings. Generally, it's going to be maybe a 5 or 6 story building, and that's it.
Yeah, I mean, there's a few taller buildings here. There's some of the hotels that are taller, the new ones in Carlsberg being.
Some of the old cathedrals.
Yeah, outside of the towers. But as opposed to in most U.S. cities, you have a central business district. I mean, even the little city that I'm from has got multiple offices that are more than 15 stories tall. And it's just not really a thing that you see here in Denmark very much.
Yeah, and part of it goes back to how old the cities are. So a lot of U.S. cities came during the time of steel and skyscrapers and the Industrial Revolution, and that's why those cities grew the way that they did. But these older cities in Denmark are a bit different.
For certain. And on top of having all the older buildings and the less skyscrapers out there, something you also notice walking around is that the city's cleaner. And I think I can say that about Copenhagen compared to even other cities in Europe. I mean, you see trash cans that are all over the place, people that are out there picking up even cigarette butts that are sitting in between the cracks of the sidewalk on there. You can really tell that the city is well taken care of. And you see that when you walk around, that other than the inevitable graffiti that you do see around the city, that it's generally pretty clean.
Yeah. And, that sanitation is an important part of living in Denmark. Another thing that definitely surprises a lot of people is drinking in public. And I actually really like this, that you can go and have a picnic and have a bottle of wine or some beers in a park or any public space, even walking down the street. And that is very different than the US, save maybe 2 cities like Savannah and New Orleans. You just can't do that in the US. And you also see a lot of younger people drinking in Denmark, which is definitely something that surprises a lot of our friends that come to visit and us when we first got here, is that you'll see a lot of people that are maybe teenagers, 14, 15, 16, that are drinking alcohol. Now, I know that there's some restrictions on what they can buy at age 16, 18, and older, and that's also something that's big on public debate right now in Denmark. But no matter what, it's very different than being 21 before you can have a drink and not being able to do it on the street.
Yeah, whatever the law says, I can tell you what the metro looks like on a Friday evening and have a guess on what the actual drinking age is here in Denmark. I think it's funny because when we bring friends over, one of our favorite things to do is to walk into a 7-Eleven, grab some walking beers and go on a little walking tour of the city, just to kind of emphasize that, yeah, this is exactly what you can do. And also considering that we had a picnic back in Philadelphia before we moved over, where we had to hide a bottle of wine in
we
a
still got in
duffel
trouble
bag.
for it.
And we still got in trouble because the park ranger could see the little cork sticking out there and tell us you really shouldn't shouldn't do that. So yeah, that's our little experience with drinking in America.
Yeah, much more free here in Denmark. But also wanted to recommend a couple other videos. If you want to see 13 things that we didn't even know existed until we moved to Denmark, you can watch this one right here in front of me and this one in front of Mikey. You can see our 7 biggest fails that we made when we first moved to Denmark. And thanks for watching, guys. Hi, hi.
Hi.